At exactly 03:17 a.m. Washington time this morning, a document was signed behind closed doors that may have just shattered more than 150 years of alliance between the United States and Canada. According to multiple diplomatic leaks, U.S. President Donald J. Trump has issued a 48-hour ultimatum to Canada, demanding that Ottawa immediately abandon a controversial $935 billion Arctic critical minerals pact with the European Union and Japan. Within minutes, financial terminals across New York and Toronto began flashing alerts tied to a possible $412 billion cross-border liquidity freeze, while tracking systems detected U.S. surveillance aircraft circling the Northwest Passage. Yet major networks remain strangely silent, and somewhere in Ottawa right now, officials are staring at a clock that is already counting down the next 48 hours. Because if these reports are accurate, the geopolitical balance of North America could shift before the deadline expires. So subscribe right now, because while mainstream media may take another 18 hours to shape the narrative, here we are breaking down what could become the biggest rupture in North American history before the countdown reaches zero. In the next 12 minutes, we're going to break down 3 critical layers of this crisis that the public hasn't fully understood yet. First, we'll expose the hidden Arctic resource battle that triggered this sudden 48-hour ultimatum. Second, we'll reveal the $412 billion financial pressure point Washington may be preparing to pull against Canada's economy. And finally, we'll walk through 3 possible outcomes when the deadline expires, including the scenario that could fracture North America's strategic alliance permanently. Stay with me, because the final scenario may explain why this ultimatum was issued in the first place. To understand why a 48-hour ultimatum would suddenly appear between 2 countries that share the longest undefended border in the world, we need to step back and examine the deeper mechanics of what may be unfolding beneath the surface. Because according to several geopolitical analysts and defense insiders, this confrontation was not created overnight. It has likely been building quietly for years. Let's start with what may be the first critical piece of evidence. Evidence 1, the Arctic resource battlefield. The Arctic is no longer just a frozen wilderness. Over the last decade, geological surveys from multiple international agencies have suggested that the Arctic region may contain nearly 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its untapped natural gas. But perhaps even more important in today's technological era are rare earth minerals, materials essential for electric vehicles, advanced weapon systems, satellites, and artificial intelligence infrastructure. The controversial deal at the center of this crisis, the $935 billion Arctic Critical Minerals Pact, reportedly negotiated between Canada, the European Union, and Japan, would effectively redirect enormous future mineral supply chains toward European and Asian industries rather than American manufacturing networks. And that shift could have massive consequences. According to Professor Michael Beckley, a well-known geopolitical analyst who studies global power competition, resource control in strategic regions often determines which economies dominate the next technological cycle. In a recent discussion about Arctic competition, he warned that whoever secures long-term access to rare earth supply lines may gain a decisive advantage in AI, aerospace, and advanced defense manufacturing. In other words, this may not simply be a trade dispute. It may be the opening move in a much larger resource power struggle. Evidence 2. The financial pressure point. Now let's look at the second layer of the situation, the financial system. Reports circulating among financial institutions early this morning suggest that U.S. authorities may be preparing the legal framework for a $412 billion cross-border liquidity freeze targeting financial channels that facilitate Canada's participation in the Arctic Minerals Pact. To understand how serious that could be, we need to look at how deeply the two economies are intertwined. Every single day, approximately $3.6 billion in goods and services cross the U.S.-Canada border. Energy flows from Alberta, manufacturing components move between Ontario and Michigan, agricultural products travel in both directions. The economic integration between the two countries is one of the most complex supply chains on the planet. So, if Washington were to suddenly restrict financial liquidity channels supporting Canadian energy and mining exports, the shock would not be limited to Ottawa. It would ripple through Detroit auto factories, Texas refineries, and even California technology manufacturers. That's why several economists are already warning about the scale of the potential disruption. Billionaire investor Warren Buffett once famously described the U.S.-Canada economic relationship as one of the most quietly powerful economic partnerships in modern history. While he was speaking in a different context, the implication remains relevant. When two economies are this deeply connected, any disruption carries enormous consequences. And that may explain why financial markets reacted so quickly to early rumors of the ultimatum. Some overnight currency trading platforms reported unusual volatility in the Canadian dollar, while energy futures briefly spiked as traders attempted to assess whether Canadian oil shipments could become entangled in retaliatory tariffs. At this point, none of those disruptions have fully materialized. But the mere possibility has already triggered a wave of speculation across global markets. Now let's move to the third piece of evidence, which may be even more revealing. Evidence 3. Military signals in the Arctic. Shortly after the reported executive order was signed, aviation tracking data began circulating among defense analysts, showing multiple U.S. reconnaissance aircraft operating near the Arctic corridor, particularly around the Northwest Passage. Now, this does not necessarily mean military confrontation is imminent. Surveillance flights occur frequently in strategic regions, but the timing is difficult to ignore. The Arctic has quietly become one of the most contested geopolitical theaters on Earth. Russia has been expanding its Arctic military infrastructure. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and invested heavily in polar shipping routes. NATO countries have increased cold weather military exercises. So, when reconnaissance flights appear at the same moment an economic ultimatum emerges, analysts begin asking questions. Retired U.S. four-star General Philip Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, once warned that the Arctic could become a central strategic corridor in the coming decades because new shipping routes may shorten global trade pathways between Asia, Europe, and North America. Control of those routes would reshape global logistics. If Canada's Arctic infrastructure were integrated more closely with European and Asian partners, Washington might fear losing influence over one of the most strategically valuable transit zones of the 21st century. That possibility adds an entirely new dimension to the ultimatum. Evidence 4. The political calculation. Now we arrive at the fourth and perhaps most complex piece of the puzzle. The political calculation behind issuing such a dramatic deadline. Ultimatums in international diplomacy are rare for a reason. They are extremely risky. If the other side refuses to comply, the issuing country is forced to either escalate or lose credibility. So why issue one now? Some analysts believe the answer may lie in timing. If Canadian policymakers have already made long-term commitments within the Arctic Minerals Pact, then waiting another year or even another 6 months could make it impossible to reverse those agreements. That means the 48-hour deadline might be designed as a shock tactic, a sudden demand, a narrow time window, a massive economic threat. The goal may not necessarily be immediate compliance. Instead, it could be intended to force emergency negotiations before the pact becomes irreversible. And that brings us to a critical turning point in this unfolding story. Because if Canada refuses the ultimatum, Washington will face a choice of its own: either follow through with economic retaliation or step back and risk appearing weak on a strategic resource issue. At this stage, no official confirmation has fully validated the leaked details of the ultimatum. But the alignment of financial signals, surveillance activity, and diplomatic whispers suggests that something significant may indeed be unfolding behind closed doors. And if you're beginning to see how these pieces connect, hit the like button right now, because the situation we're examining isn't just about one policy dispute. It's about who will control the next generation of strategic resources, industrial supply chains, and Arctic trade routes. And that brings us to the most critical question of all. What happens when the 48-hour clock runs out? Now we arrive at the moment where the entire crisis begins to hinge on one simple factor: time. Because if the reports are accurate, the 48-hour deadline attached to Washington's ultimatum is already ticking down. And once that clock reaches zero, 3 very different scenarios could unfold, each one carrying massive consequences for North America and the global economy. Let's examine them carefully. Scenario 1, full concession. In the first scenario, Canada decides the economic risk is simply too high. Ottawa could announce a temporary suspension of the $935 billion Arctic Minerals Agreement with the European Union and Japan, framing it as a strategic review rather than a surrender. Diplomatically, this would give both sides an escape route. Washington could claim victory for protecting North American resource security, while Canadian leaders could present the pause as a responsible step toward renegotiation. In this scenario, the immediate crisis would likely fade within days. Financial markets would stabilize. The threat of the $412 billion liquidity freeze would disappear, and both governments could quietly reopen negotiations behind closed doors. But there would still be consequences. Canada's European and Japanese partners would likely view the sudden reversal as a sign that North American politics can override long-term resource agreements. That could weaken Canada's credibility as a strategic supplier in the global minerals race. So even the most peaceful outcome would leave political scars. Scenario 2, partial compliance. The second possibility is more complicated. Canada could refuse to abandon the Arctic Pact entirely, but offer limited concessions designed to calm Washington's concerns. For example, Ottawa might agree to allocate a larger share of future mineral exports to U.S. industries, or create joint North American oversight of Arctic resource development. This kind of compromise would allow Canada to preserve its broader agreement with European and Japanese partners, while giving the United States a meaningful role in the supply chain. However, partial compliance carries its own risks. If Washington believes the concessions are insufficient, the administration might still impose targeted tariffs or financial restrictions, not a full economic freeze, but enough pressure to keep negotiations ongoing. In that case, the crisis would not disappear. Instead, it would transform into a prolonged geopolitical standoff that could drag on for months. And during that time, markets would remain volatile, investment decisions would stall, and energy supply chains across North America could face ongoing uncertainty. Scenario 3. Total breakdown. The third scenario is the most dangerous. and the one that many analysts quietly fear. If Canada rejects the ultimatum outright and Washington follows through with its threats, the United States could activate the $412 billion cross-border liquidity restrictions, impose sweeping tariffs on Canadian energy exports, and begin restructuring supply chains away from Canadian resource networks. Such a move would instantly disrupt one of the most integrated economic partnerships in the world. Factories in the American Midwest that rely on Canadian components could face shortages. Canadian energy producers could lose access to key refining markets. Financial institutions in both countries would scramble to reroute capital flows. And the geopolitical consequences could be even larger. Canada might accelerate cooperation with the European Union and Asian partners, effectively shifting parts of its economic orientation away from Washington. In response, the United States could strengthen resource partnerships with other suppliers, fragmenting what was once a unified North American industrial system. If that happens, historians may look back on this 48-hour deadline as the moment when the strategic foundation of North America began to fracture. And that leads us to the final and perhaps most uncomfortable realization. Because once alliances begin to unravel, rebuilding them is far more difficult than breaking them. So now, the clock is ticking. Somewhere between Washington and Ottawa, decisions are being made that could determine whether North America remains the world's most stable economic partnership, or whether a fracture begins that will reshape global power dynamics for decades. A 48-hour ultimatum, a $935 billion resource pact, and the threat of a $412 billion financial shock. Those numbers are not just headlines. They represent the pressure points of an alliance that has defined the continent for more than a century. If the deadline passes without compromise, the consequences may ripple far beyond the Arctic or the mineral trade. They could redefine supply chains, strategic alliances, and the balance of economic influence across the Western world. But here's the real question. Has Washington pushed too far, or did Ottawa trigger this crisis by shifting its strategic alliances? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every perspective. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next 48 hours could reveal how this story truly ends.